All right, thanks, Jordan. Thanks to all of you for joining as well. And it's a pleasure for me to be a part of this Q&A session this morning. I hope my screen is clear and that you can hear me clearly. Jordan, maybe let me know if there's a problem. So we want to walk through just a quick review of the proposal and kind of why we are where we are today. And then we'll work our way through the questions that were submitted ahead of time, as Jordan mentioned. And then if there's time at the end, take some questions from those of you who are on this call. Yeah, what a crazy time we are living in. And I don't know what it's been like for you at your schools, for those of you who are based in a school. Not an ideal environment to try to have anything accomplished around school sports. And so this call this morning, I hope, will be beneficial for all of us, even if nothing else, to reconnect with those of you who maybe haven't seen each other for a while. So just a quick rundown of the governance proposal and why we're doing this Q&A today. Our intention is to start or continue the discussion, restart it, that was begun last January, February, when the proposal was first released, with the intent that it would be voted on at our April AGM. Of course, that didn't happen. And so now we're looking at having an AGM next spring. We're targeting a date of May 1st. That's not set in stone, but that's what we're hoping for. And so today is the first of several Q&A sessions that we'll have throughout the winter, so that people are best informed. So why are we doing a governance review, or why have we proposed a governance review? Well, what we learned at in our strategic planning process from a couple of years ago is a recognition in the province, in the high school or school athletics world, that our organization needed a refresh. It needed an opportunity to become a more efficient and up-to-date organization. Right around the same time, the board received notification from the gaming branch, as you see on your screen, that our structure was not something that they were very pleased with, and they were asking us to rein it in a sense, to bring some greater oversight and accountability to it. Since the commissions were receiving gaming funds from BC School Sports, they tasked BC School Sports with creating a structure that would have more oversight. And so a committee was struck, and they began their work almost 2 years ago. You can see on your screen, Jordan, if you can just flip to the committee members who was on the committee, if you didn't know it already. A number of people from a variety of areas in the province, those involved at the school level, and then those involved at other levels as well. So you can see that. I won't read their names. So the next slide has their mandate. And so they were tasked with exploring all aspects of governance, from membership classes to the way we conduct meetings, how we vote, tiering, sport commissions, local associations, and everything tied to BC School Sports. So the process involved exploring our structure, the current structure that we have. Jordan, next slide. And looking at its limitations as well as its strengths. It categorized, or the committee looked at 4 categories: the philosophical, financial, operational, and legal liability aspects of the organization. It then, after looking at how we run things in BC, compared that to similar jurisdictions in North America, a couple of Canadian provinces, and then 4 US states that are closest in size and structure to BC. The idea was that we would be then, after we looked at how we do things, compared it to how other jurisdictions do things, we would then create a model that would be unique to BC. What we learned in this process, of course, and you've no doubt read the document, many of you have, is that BC is a significant outlier when it comes to school sport organization structure. And so that recognizing that right near the beginning of the process, almost 2 years ago, then prompted us to say, okay, so how is it that BC is so unique? Is there something unique about BC that would cause us to maybe retain much of what we currently have? Or is there a way to mesh some of the unique aspects of what BC does with a more coherent model that is similar to what other jurisdictions do? And so in essence, that's what we tried to do. So you can see the model on your screen. There are two aspects of it, the governing side and the operating side. And so it's on the governing side that we would have the biggest changes in our structure. And probably the most obvious change would be a legislative assembly rather than an annual AGM where all member schools could send a representative. I'm not going to go through in detail the various committees, but just to highlight a couple of things on the next slide, Jordan, in the Legislative Assembly. One of the things that we really wanted to get right in this model was equity. And by equity, I mean fair representation from various jurisdictions. What I've learned over the years in attending the AGMs is it's heavily weighted to people from the Lower Mainland, as the AGMs are typically held in the Lower Mainland. We have tried to move them around just to acknowledge the fact that BC is a large province with a diverse set of interests throughout the various zones. But the reality was most of the AGMs were in the Lower Mainland, and most of the representatives were from the Lower Mainland schools. And so the new Legislative Assembly tries to acknowledge that we want to have representation, equal representation from throughout the province. So that's a geographical diversity, but then we also are looking for people at the table who may not have attended an AGM, but have an interest in school sport. And so there's a place for various partner organizations. But I think for me, one of the key things in not only the Legislative Assembly, but in some of the other committees, including the board, is a gender recognition that it has been primarily men on the board and primarily men who attend the AGM. And so one of the key ideas driving the changes is a desire for equity, gender equity, among other things. And that's an important part for me personally that I think is a significant reason why I am advocating for this new model. In the board of directors itself, the next screen, you can see the roles and responsibilities, the composition. There will be members who are elected by the Legislative Assembly, and you can see what their tasks are. And as it said there, it says there on the intended outcome, it's intended to be an appropriate cross-sections of persons from different regions and experiences. And that's what we're striving for. You can see on the next slide the details of how the various 9 positions will be allocated. And again, that is very intentional, unlike our current structure where board members put their name forward or they're nominated by someone maybe in their region. Here we're being very intentional to have representation from throughout the province as well as gender representation. So that's on the directors, the board, then the governing committees, and you can see here is where we have some new committees that will be quite different from the current structure. So we have sport championship committees, both on the team sport and individual sports side, and then rules committees broken down into the 3 seasons of play. And then a tiering and sport evaluation committee. And all of those 6 committees will be new. And then The EAC, Competitive Fairness, and Sport Medicine and Athlete Safety Committees will continue from their current structure. The next slide just talks about what their mandates will be. As I said, the three that we currently have, those won't change. But the sport championship committees, which include, as I said, the team sport and individual sport, they'll focus on the policies around championships, including size and structure, berthing policy, seating and ranking, and discipline and appeals. And then the rules committees will look specifically at how the rules of play for the sports in their various seasons are conducted, all the way from technical rules and how games are run to field of play, uniforms, equipment, officials, discipline, and so on. That's something we haven't had before, and that, again, will be a significant change. But as we've learned in this process, virtually every other jurisdiction in North America has these kinds of committees, and so there is a structure to them rather than a sport commission making these rules. The Tiering and Sport Evaluation Committee, that is also new, and it's, again, a broader look at how we organize our championships and which sports are included. Then on the operating committee side, we're looking to have an opportunity for many of you, hopefully, and many others who have been involved over the years in various committees or running championships. The idea is that these groups of committees will work very closely with BCSS staff and have their support. And the idea is that as our provincial championships continue, and that's one of the ideas, by the way, that came out in some of the conversations I had, that this new model will put an end to provincial championships, and that's the farthest thing from the truth. In fact, our intention is to strengthen them and have a greater degree of uniformity and consistency among them, so that regardless of which sport a student athlete participates in, if their school happens to qualify for the provincials, it will be an outstanding experience for them. And so more support from BCSS staff and opportunities then for volunteers to get involved at a variety of levels. One of the things that we're also excited about is the History and Archives Committee. We're looking to, again, have a broad array of information available to people who are interested in the history of school sport in BC. And right now, again, there isn't a common repository of information or even a place where people can go. Okay, so that was a very quick overview of our proposal. And so now we're going to enter into looking at the questions that were submitted. Our Vice President, Brent Sweeney, and I will kind of tag team. And then Jordan, I hope you'll be available if there are things that we can't answer. So Brent, I'm going to turn the first one over to you.
Rick, I think Brent was, he said he was tied up for the first 15 minutes.
Right.
So you might
Brent
have to.
is coming late.
Yes.
Okay, then I'll start. That's right. He's going to join us shortly. That's right. I forgot about that. Okay, so let's just start rolling through the questions then. By the way, as a classroom teacher, I found teaching this way last spring, teaching electronically, very painful, and I'm experiencing it again this morning where I can't see your faces and I can't get a feel for the pacing of what I'm doing or just a general sense of it. So if you have some comments, I see one comment in the chat, could these slides be made available? But if there are other things that come up, feel free to interrupt me or stop me. Since I can't see you and tell if you're tracking with me, I'm assuming that you are, and we'll carry on. Okay, so the first question, was there any consideration given to break down the governance proposal? Yes and no. we did look at that, and we understand that this is a massive, massive change. And so we're not immune to that fact. However, to try to vote on aspects of this separately, I think would have caused potentially more issues than voting on it all together. The entire thing is interdependent. And so you can't really create, let's say, a legislative assembly. That's one of the things that we pondered as parts or members of the committee. Could we replace the current AGM model with a legislative assembly and then leave the rest of our structure intact? And we felt very strongly that no, we couldn't. We feel like the Legislative Assembly will be a far more nimble body than the annual AGM, and will have the capacity to deal with issues as they arise far more quickly, and be making educated and informed decisions more readily. And so that then will filter down to the various aspects of what BC School Sports does. So it's one package because we think it all fits together, and separating it out, we just feel will weaken the entire package as well as the entire process. Okay, next question was a concern that the rules and regulations will not reflect the uniqueness of specific sports. And you notice that we have rules committees based on the 3 seasons. And so how will those committees actually be able to make rules specific to one particular sport? So what we're anticipating is those rules committees will have 2 experts, 1 male and 1 female, from each of the sports in that season. And so the role of the rules committee will be to take feedback from tournament hosts, coaches, staff, and conduct research to consider future changes. For example, I've been involved in coaching basketball for many years. And so one of the things we have noticed is the shot clock. If you're familiar with basketball, you know that FIBA has a 24-second shot clock, as does the NBA. But yet in many other jurisdictions, it's a different length of time, 30 seconds, 35 seconds in the NCAA. There's even more variations. In BC, there's a variation between boys and girls in terms of the length of the shot clock. So these kinds of committees will have experts from the various sports on them, and will have a broader view of examining the specific rules and regulations around that sport. And so we're hopeful that if there are changes necessary, that committee, those committees, I should say, will be able to respond in a way that is rational and takes into account the uniqueness of school sport in BC. As far as championships, one of the desires that comes out of this proposal is that the championships are more consistent and equitable across the board. I mentioned that already. The intent is that our BC School Sports brand and image be consistent and a consistent quality of experience. I alluded to that already. At the same time, though, we still expect that and value that the sport-specific nuances between sports and between experts on rules and championships committees will allow for variation. I mean, a volleyball championship as opposed to a track and field championship will be very different just by the nature of their sports, the nature of one being indoor, one being outdoor. And so we understand that there will be uniqueness to each sport championship. And we believe that the rules committees will have enough experts on them to address that. Okay, the next question was, are we considering any modifications to our proposal? You should know that, as I mentioned, the first proposal was presented to the board in January of this year, and on behalf of the committee. So the committee presented a proposal to the board discussed it, made some tweaks. Then we started asking for feedback to it in February. Again, recognized, okay, there's some things that we could tweak. And then just on Thursday, we had a call with the sport commissioners, and some ideas came out of that call that has prompted us to think, okay, maybe there are some other tweaks that we can make. We're not anticipating major changes, but as we continue to receive feedback from people, whether it's sport commissions, individuals, we are certainly willing to look at those suggestions. And if there's ways to make this model better and gain the support of a broader community in BC, we are certainly willing to do that. We will continue to welcome feedback. As I said, this is our first Q&A, and we anticipate doing several more over the winter. Our goal, as I said, is to bring this to an AGM in spring. We're targeting May 1st. That date is not set in stone, but we anticipate that over the coming months, we may continue to make tweaks and then bring a final proposal prior to the AGM next spring. Okay, the next question, and Jordan, let me know when Brent joins us, and then I can let him jump in at times as well. The next question was, why is the board proposing these changes during the pandemic? Shouldn't we have the benefit of an in-person AGM for sure, and even meetings leading up to an AGM? Wouldn't that be beneficial? Of course it would, and we're not ignorant to that. However, at the same time, I don't know how many of you are ADs at schools, but as an AD at my school, I have found obviously that my time looks very different. Probably even for some of you, if you are ADs, your time's been reduced, as mine has. But at the same time, there's opportunities for pursuing other things, and that's what we hope will happen during the pandemic, that we actually have time to dive into this model more thoroughly than we might if this was a regular school year where we're running tournaments. And I mean, this weekend I think would have been possibly the aquatics championships, soccer provincials may have been next week, I think. And so in the absence of those, and in the absence of needing to prep our teams and our schools for those, we're hoping that you'll take the time available to you to see yourself looking into this model more thoroughly. One of the things that you, if you've attended AGMs, know that the majority of votes are cast in advance ballots anyway. Boy, I could really get into advanced voting and mail-in voting right now, but I'm going to avoid that. As a socials teacher, this is really hard for me to resist, but that's the reality of our AGM as well, that many of the votes have been cast in advance, or in prior years we had proxy votes. And so the argument that while we must do this face-to-face or else we don't really have a real sense of where people are at, I think that's not entirely accurate. Never mind the fact that I mentioned earlier in my opening comments that the Gaming Commission and the gaming funds we receive are dependent on us improving the accountability of our organization. And so we've already delayed it by 1 year, and I think the idea of delaying it for another year in hopes that in 2021-22 school year that we'll actually be face-to-face, that's just not something that we think is practical at this point. Okay, next question. And again, if you have points you want to make while I'm talking, feel free to interrupt me, and then Jordan can pay attention to those comments and let me know. Okay, so one of the questions that has come up in a variety of the conversations in the last years, why does in the Legislative Assembly, why does the body representing schools not have the majority of votes? The reality is they do. And that's one of the tweaks we made, you should know, from the original proposal. And so in that legislative assembly, 27 of the 53 representatives are from the 9 zones. And we are anticipating that most of those will be ADs or other school representatives. In each of the 9 zones, they will decide how they select those people. But we're expecting that most likely all of them will be school representatives. And then, in addition, the 9 members of the board are quite likely going to be school representatives. Committee chairs will also be educators. And so our thinking is that the board will be, the Legislative Assembly will be quite well represented by schools and by school individuals. And that's an important factor for us as well, that we are not, in this model, we're not proposing a legislative assembly or even a board that is largely distant from the issues that happen at the school level. This is a school sport organization, and so the role that school members and staff play is critical for us, and we see that as critical for its success. Okay, the next question. Boy, here again, I'm going to get into my socials teacher's hat. Why don't we have rep by pop? If you've ever taught socials 10, you know that that's a question that we ask our students to ponder. So what we've done in our current model is look at equal representation in each part of the province, at least for certain aspects of the Legislative Assembly. As I mentioned, those 27 representatives, the 3 members from each of the 9 zones, each have an equal voice and an equal vote. The other members may skew heavily towards one area or region, but the idea is that one of the shortcomings that we recognized in our current model is, as I said already, most of the people who attend the AGM are people from the Lower Mainland, because most of the AGMs take place in the Greater Vancouver area. And so we really see that as a shortcoming. In fact, I've been at some of the AGMs where votes are cast on suggestions from rural communities, where Lower Mainland coaches or ADs who attend the AGM have just felt like, no, that would not work for us, and so we're going to defeat that. We think a legislative assembly that's more broadly represented from each region of the province will allow a broader view of issues as they come up. And so we are quite adamant that will continue in our current model. I mean, one of the things out of the rezoning that happened a couple of years ago is that when we went from 7 zones to 9 zones, recognized that the Fraser Valley was divided into 3. And so the reality is you still will have a greater representation from the Lower Mainland as it is. I'm noticing a couple of questions that came up. Jordan, Chris Ball asked about the number of members of the Legislative Assembly being 55.
So Chris is looking at the first version, not the second version that was sent out 2 or 3 weeks ago. What I'll do is I'll post a link to the updated version in the chat box. So if anybody's looking at the prior version, then they can grab that quickly. So just give me half a second. I'll throw that in there.
Right. And while Jordan is doing that, I will mention that the latest one that was sent out was sent on October 30th. So a week ago yesterday. And so that's the one that I'm looking at when I am answering questions. And there you can see Jordan put the link in the chat. Okay, Chris, I think that hopefully that addresses your question. Jordan, my voice is getting tired. Has Brent joined us yet?
He texted me to say that his internet is not working. He's driving to his mom's house. He'll be on in a couple minutes.
Oh my, he is dedicated. Okay, well, let's keep going then. Jordan, I'm going to let you answer this one if you would.
Sure. So, I mean, it's, you know, some people would say, well, should we answer that? But I think in the interest of transparency, I don't know why we wouldn't. So just to understand what the investment was from the BC School of Sports perspective on behalf of the membership, the strategic planning process, there was an RFP that went out. I think we had actually 9 really, I think we had a couple more than that. A couple weren't very good, but 9 really good proposals. This is going back to the strat planning, not the governance, just to be clear. The board looked at all those. There was 3 really, really strong candidates, of which Decatur was the winner of that. And so we went through that process. Coming out of that, then when the governance, obviously the gaming letter, the governance came through very strongly on the strategic planning. The question that I asked the board was, you know, do we want to go back to an RFP, or do we want to use Decatur again, seeing how, you know, they're very comfortable and know our organization pretty well. And work a lot in this area. So the board made the decision to go with Decatur. So we asked them for a proposal and the governance project was, it was $10,000 for the year's work of leading that committee. That breaks out to about $22 per member school. If you have any experience working with consultants in this field, you know, $10,000 for a project like this is not very much money at all. And so I think the board, and I would echo this, feel that they got extremely good value for that investment on behalf of the membership. And that Kim, the principal, who I think some of you have spoken with, who led that committee and process, certainly was very valuable and has continued to kind of help us out with various questions and things without any cost after the scope of the project was done. So that was that.
Okay, thanks, Jordan. Yeah, anytime you hire a consultant, that's one of the questions that typically comes up. How much did they get paid, and was it really value for the money? I would say it was. And as Jordan just mentioned, Kim was fantastic. And of course, I was in on the sessions with the committee. And so they did a fantastic job. Kim was outstanding. And as Jordan said, they have continued to provide support for us along the way. Okay, let's get to the next question. Why are you taking away schools' right to vote? Yeah, and this, again, I'll try not to slip into teacher mode, but direct democracy versus representative democracy, that's really at the heart of this question. And the questioner rightly said, democracy is messy and never easy. Why do we need to centralize power? Well, just historically, from my experience, my involvement with BC School Sports, I started attending AGMs about 8 or 9 years ago. I've been involved in coaching high school girls basketball for the most part for many years, almost 30 years. But I hadn't gotten involved in BCSS at all and had not attended an AGM until the last 7 to 8 years, I think. What I learned there is that it wasn't, while the right for schools to vote was evident, most schools did not vote. And in fact, the system of voting, which allowed for proxy votes, meant that the votes were not truly representative. And I understand that proxy holder, sorry, and I'm going off script, Jordan, I hope you'll let me do this. That proxy vote holders were given some direction, but as all of us who've attended the AGMs recognize that through the discussion, sometimes the nature of the motion and the intent behind it was modified, not the motion itself, but a recognition of what it was actually going to accomplish. Well, that proxy vote holder couldn't have communicated that to all the votes that they held. And in fact, I witnessed on a few occasions a proxy vote holder who had many, many votes in their possession. And so our current system is not democratic either. Yes, the opportunity for all schools to vote is there, but the reality is most schools did not vote. And never mind, and when we compared BC to the rest of North America in terms of how school sport was organized, I don't believe there was any other jurisdiction that had every member with a vote. We actually believe, and I feel like I'm repeating myself a little bit, but we feel like the current governance proposal, which allows for 2 meetings a year or 2 sessions a year, which could end up being a couple of days, will actually allow for more feedback than the current one that meets once a year. And we're hopeful that, in fact, the schools will sense, as this model is hopefully passed next spring, that in fact they have a greater voice, and that educators will feel like they have a greater opportunity to influence school sport in the province. That's our goal. Okay, let's go to the next question.
I will let you know that Brent is now in attendance.
Perfect. Then he can answer the next question. What great timing.
Good timing, yeah. So
Yeah.
That my son's U9 soccer coaching that, and I got home and ready to go, and no internet. So I had to, thankfully my mom lives close by, so ripped over here and good to go. So why are you eliminating the experts or commissions in each of the sports? Surely their expertise is needed. Why not find a way to include them, these volunteer groups in BC school sports? Okay, so I think I have a good way of talking about this, partly because I have been involved in the soccer commission for the past decade at least, and understanding both what the commissions do as well as what I think opportunity is for the individuals who are leading their sports right now is something that we do have in this governance proposal. And what I would look at is not on the governance side, so not from a perspective of voting at an AGM or things like that, but we need to remember that commissioners don't vote at AGMs right now either, and the commissions largely exist outside, and there are some issues with that, right? So I think one of the questions alluded to the fact that we don't include, or that this proposal doesn't include community coaches, and community coaches inherently are focused on their sport and their sport only, and so from the perspective of governance, from an athletic director or principal perspective, or some of the other groups that have been invited to hopefully be a part of the new legislative assembly, they look at things from a more of a global perspective. And as a member of the commission, I fully expect to continue to be a part of running high school soccer in BC, whether or not I'm on the board or whether or not on the legislative assembly, as a member of the coaches commission, and you know, we have heard from commissioners, and we have heard from commissions about the need to formalize something a little more. So there may be some tweaks and changes as we move forward here, and we haven't gotten a full discussion from the board level about that, but just know that we are listening and we are aware of the concerns of commissioners, and this is not an opportunity for us to say, perfect, all right, now we get the chance to run all the sports, because we can't do that. And I have no interest in running aquatics or badminton or track and field. I'm interested in ensuring that high school soccer in BC is successful and it runs properly and that things are done well. And so I think that we do have an opportunity and a place for these people to who have volunteered a long time, and this is where outside coaches can be a part of the coaches committee, right? They can be a part of this group that is able to help set the direction for their sport. I think we've shown as a board that when sports have well thought out proposals to come forward, that we've supported those at the board level and at the AGM, and I don't see that changing. So I think members of commissions and commissioners as well, I think we need to do a better job of having that conversation of where they can be, and this is not a situation where I'm not interested in running other sports. I'm interested in the global perspective of school sport in BC, and I have a role to play as an executive member of my commission. So I hope I answered that in a not too long-winded way.
Okay, thanks, Brent. So Jordan, next question. Yeah, the question of non-educator coaches or community coaches, where do they fit? And then the sub-question was, didn't BCSS recently change the rule to accommodate our former president? This is a really important question, and it was one that we wanted to make sure came up this morning. And I think there's two parts to it. So the first part is that we are a school sport organization. We are managed by the schools and overseen by the schools. And so that's an important part of it. So that's from the one side. And then on the other side is we are under the authority of the provincial government. And so there is a responsibility to ensure that we're looking after the school side of our oversight. And so when we have non-educator coaches involved, and again, as I said, I've coached girls basketball for many years and have seen that fact very evident, that many of the especially senior level coaches are not educators. And so how do we navigate through that when the organization itself has a mandate that comes from the schools and the provincial government, but the specific sports may have or be influenced by many non-educators? So again, as Brent even said in the last answer, our intent is that there is a place to plug in for those who are not educators, whether it's on ranking committees, host committees, coaching committees, or any of the other operational committees. There will be opportunities for non-educators or community coaches to get involved. Yes, they won't be at the Legislative Assembly. They won't be voting specifically on some of those governance things, but they have a seat at the table in a sense. They have a place where they can plug in and continue to influence sport in BC from the perspective of their sport that they're involved in a way that's still influential. And so we believe that there's a place for them, and we value their input. In fact, in many ways, many of the sports couldn't run without community coaches or non-educator coaches. And then the sub-question was about BCSS changing the rules so our former president, Mike Alina, could continue. This was something that came up at the board level as Mike had announced his retirement. And so we talked about, okay, is there a place for people like Mike who have just left the profession or maybe left it in a full-time way? And can we continue to draw on their expertise? And so the board brought a proposal to an AGM, which was approved overwhelmingly. And so, and the same offer was extended to commissioners. But we felt still that the people involved, Brent, can you mute your keyboard? we felt though that there should be limits, and so they either have to be an active TOC or no less than 2 years removed from a continuing contract. So it's not indefinite. We're not saying that board members or people involved can continue their role. If they had been an educator at one point, we felt like 2 years was an adequate amount of time to extend the opportunity for people to stay involved even after they had formally retired from their teaching profession. Okay, Brent, next question to you.
Rick, I'll just jump in there on one thing.
Okay.
I think the key there is that, as the question implies, we, as in, I think the board is suggesting the board just change the rules. The board looked at that and brought a motion to the membership to consider that had all of those things. It was for both board and commissioners, and the membership overwhelmingly supported that. That was not a board simply changing the rules on their own. So I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe we should address Paul's question. Brent has responded in the comments, but I think this is an important one because it has come up in some of our previous meetings, the sense that sport commissions will not be supportive of this model should it pass. And that some of them have already stated publicly in some cases that they will not be involved in running championships if the sport commissions are no longer present. We're aware of that, and we understand that some of those comments have been made. We are confident that some of those, specifically some of those individuals, may change their mind. But we also are hopeful that there will be other volunteers, whether it's school-based championships or central championships, that there will be other people who will step up and volunteer to help run the provincial championships, which are the key part of what we do. So we want them to be run well. Okay,
maybe Rick, I can also just talk about that in terms of losing control of how they run their event or the rules and regulations. Well, right now, our provincial championships are run on behalf of BC School Sports, with BC School Sports not really having too much say, and as a result, not really some examples, some of the costs associated with championships that schools bear the brunt of, or the amount of time that's missed, is not done with the, again, sort of global perspective. It's looking at one specific event. So I think that my sort of question would be, if you were running a championship before and it was successful, we're not interested in changing that. And again, I think of my own perspective. I've run girls soccer championships, which move around the province from site to site. And I also, as part of the executive of the soccer commission, run the boys AA and AAA championships. And I'll continue to do that because I want our event to be run well. I know how to do it. I've got some experience and some expertise in how to run that event and that championship, and I'll continue to do that. And again, whether I'm on the board or not, it's something that I enjoy doing. And so I don't really see if we lose control. I mean, there's not going to be massive changes to the way championships are run. That's not the indication. That's not the goal here, right? So for those individuals who are throwing their hands up and saying I'm out, I'm done, that's too bad. And we that's not the goal. But from a perspective of what it looks like from when commissions were running it to what it looks like afterwards, I think there's going to be very, very little difference. Okay, and so that's something to really understand.
Certainly, before you get to the next question, Brent, certainly very little difference for coaches and athletes. I don't think they'll even know necessarily that something has happened in the background. A change has happened.
That's the hope, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Next question.
Yeah, next question.
Okay, so I'll take this one. So 8 models were studied, and 6 of them were American. And is it really a fair comparison for us to try and even try to emulate what the U.S. states are doing? And that's a good question. But I think one of the things that was made very apparent to me, I was able to travel before when we were allowed to travel to Chicago a few years ago to attend the NFHS summer meetings. And this is where representatives from all of the 50 states, as well as Canada, Ontario, and BC were there. And listening to the issues that they have, they're very, very similar to what we have. Okay, and from an operational standpoint, they deal with a lot of the same things. So whether or not it's Washington State, or whether or not it's Alberta or Nova Scotia or Alabama, we deal with a lot of the same things. And what's important to recognize that even if we only looked at Canadian provinces, we are the only province that runs it this way. We're the only jurisdiction in North America that runs it this way. Okay. What we don't have a comparison of in terms of how the Americans run things is revenue. For example, in Minnesota, the Minnesota State Hockey Tournament, their 1-week tournament funds their entire operation for the whole year for every sport. Okay, so they don't get government funding because they don't need it, because they sell out the Minnesota Wild Arena for a week straight for a morning session and an evening session. We don't have that opportunity. But what we do have a similarity with is looking at how they deal with birthing, how they deal with transfers, how they deal with gender equity. Those sorts of issues are similar. Okay, and so that's what we're looking at when we're comparing different governance models between Canada and the United States, and looking at what we could do moving forward.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to attend the NFHS meetings last July, and I would echo what Brent said. We can get caught up in the fact that coaches are paid, ADs have a full-time job at a high school, large high school, and we're talking about millions and millions of dollars. They have their own streaming service and whatnot. But the reality is, at the school level, they deal with many of the same issues that we're dealing with. Okay, the next question was around rules again. How can you expect one person to be in charge of each season's rules of play when there are multiple sports? So we talked about earlier in our model that we will have a fall, winter, and spring rules committee. And I mentioned earlier in one of the other answers to a question that each of those committees will have a male and female representative from each sport on those rules committees. And so it won't be one person in charge. There will be representatives from each sport on the committees, as well as those rules committees will be tasked with consulting with the coaches committee, with rules experts from that committee, or from that sport, I should say, and then bring that information back to the rules committees, who will then consider that information for each of those sports in that season. And if there are recommendations for changes to the rules, they will be brought to the Legislative Assembly to debate and vote on. So it's not one person. And in fact, it's a broader look at rules from, again, you may argue, for example, in the fall season, you'd have boys soccer and boys and girls volleyball. So how could a committee with representatives from those sports possibly understand the rule nuances? And we understand that there will be some education that has to happen, but the intent is that there's a place for those discussions to happen at a broader level, and not at that sport-specific level where they may not take into account other perspectives. And so we think that those committees will be broad enough that there will be perspectives gained from a variety of people. And then when and if a change is necessary, that will be brought to the Legislative Assembly to also pursue and investigate and debate. And so it's certainly not one person in making rule changes. Okay, Brent, the next question. Sorry, I'm just seeing a question in the chat around separate need for rules committee for each season. Mike, I can tell you that we did talk about that when, as part of the committee, investigating different models. We are trying to incorporate as many people as possible in our model, and so that's why we have a sport rule committee for each of the 3 seasons. We think that that will give more people a voice. And yeah, you make an argument that what if those committees end up functioning very differently? I think we still have a safeguard in that any recommendations need to go to the Legislative Assembly. And so if there is inconsistency or divergence in their approaches, then we would expect the Legislative Assembly to deal with those. So I think there's enough checks and balances. And I mean, that's a great question, because I can kind of imagine how committees would take on a life of their own. And this could happen, but I trust that there's enough checks and balances that would not be the case. I noticed another question from John.
Sorry, Rick, just one thing.
Go ahead, Jordan.
I was just going to jump in. Another key factor in the rules committees and having 3 of them was the timing to bring things forward, so that there's a seasonality, so that there's with having the 2 meetings, there's an ability to kind of function before and after that season to make, look at the changes, assess the season, have discussion, do research, and then bring forth other changes. And so if you're trying to do all the sports at the same time, it's very difficult to kind of do each sport properly. So if it's narrowed down to 6 to 8 sports, they have their own schedule that's based around their season of play, at which they have to bring things forward to the Legislative Assembly. So it's also a bit of a timing issue that allows them to kind of get into a rhythm in assessing the season and bringing forth rule changes for the following year in an appropriate manner, rather than getting tied down with the next set of sports.
Right. Paul Thiessen made a good point too in the chat that some of our provincial championships have rules that actually contravene BCSS rules, especially around eligibility. I can think of one sport in particular that does that. And so, as Paul points out, it's very difficult for our ADs to really, first of all, be aware. And that caught me in my 2nd year as a coach. I wasn't aware of a different rule. And so had a team that qualified for provincials, but was not able to go because we had not filled out a registration form that I hadn't been aware of. And so there are issues with our current model as well. And I think that's what Paul is pointing out, that when we can centralize the rules and have a broader approach, that should avoid those kinds of issues. Joe, I'm not sure what you're asking for in the chat. When you say an example of a rule that committee may face, are you asking me to think of one?
Hi, Rick. This is Joe. Yes, I am asking because I can't get my head around a typical situation that would require a rule conversation.
Okay. Well,
just make one up. It doesn't have to be real, but just to help me understand it.
Yeah, no, one comes to mind right away. For boys and girls volleyball, one distinction is using the roof or not using the roof, or is the roof in play or not in play. And the girls operate under a different rule than the boys. And so the rules committee, the fall sport rules committee, would hear from representatives from that sport, and the committee members would hear the arguments pro and con. And then they would decide, okay, does that make sense to maintain that rule distinction? And then does that go to the Legislative Assembly to vote on, or maybe it doesn't even need to? And so that's an example that at least came to mind right away.
Thank you. That's a good example. And it does, of course, raise another point, and that is, and I think you've sort of addressed it, because that would be that is a concern I personally have, that we become so uniform in all our rules across all sports that there isn't a place to have differences between sports.
Yeah.
So good example. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, and Jody brought up the shot clock example that I mentioned earlier too, that the boys and girls operate on different shot clock lengths. Before Brent goes to the question about the specific sport evaluation and tiering committee, I noticed that John Mayan asked about, kind of made a comment about a question we had a little bit ago about volunteer involvement. I think we've answered this, but John, I'll just make a comment again. We recognize that, and I think Brent said this, we will not be able to run all the championships, and the BCSS staff will certainly not be able to run all the championships across our province in all the different sports that we support. So we will be reaching out to community people, school-based individuals, coaches, or ADs, or other volunteers. We are hopeful that some of the people currently involved will be willing to stay involved. Maybe their title will change or their specific role may change, but we're hoping that they'll still stay involved and that they will continue to get others involved in running the championship. So as every organization is facing with volunteer fatigue, so is school sport. And so we're going to have to continue to develop ways to enhance volunteer involvement.
Paul just had a question. I don't think we need to go down the rabbit hole of shot clock boys and girls right now, but that's something, Paul, I think that the coaches committees of each sport would talk about. And this is where I think some recommendations and proposals could come out of. Okay, and so if there was a appetite to do that, I know the Referees Association certainly would be happy if that happened, but we don't operate based on them. I know that in the United States, just listening to having been a part of that conversation at the NFHS meeting about shot clock, and not everybody uses it, and it was the states that do were, they were saying, why would you not use the shot clock? That's what basketball is. And the other states said, well, now I got to pay $4 extra for someone to run the shot clock at my game. And so, yeah, I think this is, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but certainly this is not, we're not stating that, okay, well, now we're going to make things uniform between boys and girls sports, because if there's differences, and if those differences are ones that benefit the sport, or if that's where the sport is moving to, maybe that's what it looks at. But we're not sitting here and saying that we're going to make it so that all rules are uniform. That's not the goal of those rules committees.
Yeah, Brent, just before the last question too, John added that the way high school boys and girls basketball provincials are seeded, tournament selection, wild cards, and so on, they are currently quite different as well. And so that would be another area that the various committees would investigate and come with recommendations. And again, as Brent just said, it may make sense to leave it the way it is. No one on the BCSS board or those on the committee are looking to make changes that don't make sense. If it makes sense to keep it the way things are, whether it's using the roof or not in volleyball, or berthing for basketball provincials, then that will stay the way it is. Okay, Jordan, the last question I think Brent's going to address is on sport evaluation and tiering committee.
Yep, and so let me just get down to that question. So it would the sport evaluation tiering committee have the power to recommend the potential removal of current sports, and if a sport is removed, will they have the ability to still operate without being an official BC school sport? Okay, so the TSC would evaluate the addition and removal of sports. Okay, one thing to note, as we currently have it's the membership that makes the decision. So just because this sport evaluation tiering committee potentially would have made a recommendation, it's the membership that makes the call. So the legislative assembly would make that decision. This is not a workaround to say, okay, we think that we only need 14 sports, so we're going to cut 5. We know that sports have been added and removed from BC School Sports over the years. What we don't have is really a very effective way of evaluating what sports should continue, or maybe there needs to be a change to tiers. Some sports have been larger over the years and now have been reduced, and so maybe it's time to look at reducing the number of tiers in potential sports. And so the committee is going to have to evaluate a way of doing that. If a sport was removed, that doesn't mean that those schools who participate in that sport wouldn't be able to continue. I know of in the Triple SAA in Surrey as an example, they have ice hockey, they have cricket at times. I think they've had kabaddi before, right? So there's a lot of different sports that operate in BC that are outside of BC School Sports. Right now, this year, which may be a foreign to this group of sport-minded people, but we have esports, and that's a trial that's running this year, and it's going to be very successful. It's going to be very successful, and it's opening up our potential sort of group to offering some of the team-based benefits that maybe some of these kids don't have an opportunity to have. We know the benefits of being members of a team, and while we probably in this group would prefer activity over a sedentary thing, there are benefits to that as well. So that's a model though. As a demonstration sport, we've put out a request for schools to join or not join, and it's been successful. So that's something that potentially moving forward the TSE committee could use, okay, and could do. One thing that's also important to understand here is that there's an effect on the budget of our organization, right? And so if sports are added or removed, that can have an impact on membership dues and the overall budget itself, okay? Sports can't currently remove themselves, and member schools do. If a sport is offered by BC School Sports, that is the only sort of category of sport that they can play. So we couldn't have, for instance, if there was a rogue aquatics league as an example, right? Those schools that were participating in that would face some penalties, and they wouldn't be able to participate in any other BC School Sports. Okay, and so those are current rules, and again, that's subject to change as the membership or as the Legislative Assembly decides. But yes. So if a school, if a sport was removed, schools could continue to participate in that sport outside of BCSS.
Brent, I thought of another example about a sport that was introduced in the last couple of years is ultimate, right? We introduced the board, heard from some interested parties who were wondering why it wasn't a school sport. And so we piloted a provincial tournament a couple of years ago, and it went really well. And so now that has become an official school sport. So that's the kind of thing that this committee would do. David
Mills. Just would this see the end of invitational junior championships as they're not BC School Sports sanctioned events? Not all, as Joe pointed out, commissions are not necessarily running these events, and I don't think actually most of them. I think most of them are separate and run by either school-based groups or different outside agents. Okay, that's a whole other question about junior and grade 8, grade 9 provincial championships to talk about, but that's not necessarily they're not all run by the commissions.
Okay, that I think brings us to the end of the questions that were submitted ahead of time. And so we've had questions that have arisen already in the chat, and we've tried to address those, but are there other questions? We're we're scheduled to go to 12 noon. I would be happy if it doesn't go to 12 noon, but I'm ready to stay here till then if there are further questions that anyone might have, and we'll try to address them.
Rick, would you like questions to come in written, or do you want people to put their hand up? What's your preference?
Yeah, I'm okay with either.
Okay.
It just might expedite things if they are submitted in the chat. So rather than people turning their audio on or their microphones on, it might just be easier if we have it in written form. But I'm okay if people would rather turn their mic on as well.
Great. So yeah, so if you have questions or comments, I just see Sue put one in there. If you have questions, put them in the chat. If we need further clarification, then obviously we can unmute and have a bit of a dialogue. But to start, let's, any follow-up questions or new questions, any questions on sort of how this works or who goes where, or this is your chance to sort of learn. So feel free to put anything you want to know about in the chat.
I'll just comment on what Sue posted there. It's terrific. And Sue's got a great perspective, having been involved on many different levels. And so I appreciate what you've written there, Sue. And we would agree that we are hopeful that a new model will not be the demise of school sport, as some have suggested, but in fact will enhance it and will give greater opportunities for students to showcase their talents. One of the things that didn't come up before we get to Paul's question is, now I lost my train of thought. It came out of what Sue said. Oh yes, the idea of sponsorship. Brent addressed that question and said in the States, of course, you're talking about millions of dollars of money involved in school sport. He used the Minnesota hockey tournament as an example. But one thing that I've learned over the years as someone involved in coaching girls basketball, but then as an AD involved at hosting various provincial tournaments. Cross country was the one most recently last fall. MEI was the co-host of the cross country provincials. Is the difficulty in obtaining sponsorship money. And one thing that our current model has as a weakness, I think, is each sport pursuing corporate sponsors individually. And I think there's tremendous strength to be gained by having a unified approach. And that was one of the things I learned at the NFHS meeting last summer, is how states take on a state direction for sponsorship and pursuing sponsorship dollars. And of course, many of their state organizations have larger staff and they have people dedicated to just that, or maybe that's one of their tasks. But even the idea alone, or the concept alone of having a unified voice who would go to corporate donors and say, hey, here's what we can offer you, that would apply to all sports, or maybe they would want to pick and choose certain sports. That's just something that we don't currently have. We have some great local BC companies like BC Milk or Subway who are sponsoring various provincials, but to have that opportunity to pursue corporate sponsorship at a unified, or with a unified voice, I think could be powerful. So Paul asked a question about giving commissions a seat at the table. And that came up on Thursday in our call with the commissioners. And I think I would respond to that, and then Brent, feel free to jump in as well, is we are looking, as I said at the start, to continue to tweak our model. And if there's a way for us to incorporate the voice that the commissions currently have into it, beyond even what we currently have, or maybe inserting it into some of the committees that are in the proposal, we are very much open to doing that. And as we've said this morning and in other settings, our intent is not to eliminate the commissions, or sorry, to eliminate the what the commissions do, we will still need much of that. What we're asking for is a different model of structuring our sport in BC. And we're hoping that the commissions will come on board and recognize that there's still a place for them in this new model. Brent, you had kind of alluded to that as well.
Yeah, and this was something that, you know, a tweaking again of sort of not the governance side of things in terms of a seat at the Legislative Assembly, because again, right now commissioners, it's parallel. They don't have a vote at the AGM. So if Don Moslin, who's the commissioner of the soccer commissioner, you know, he potentially could attend the AGM and vote on behalf of his school, but the commissioners don't have a vote at the AGM. So our Legislative Assembly proposal really doesn't change that. From the opposite side from the governance part of things, you know, we are looking to potentially, we've heard that dialogue from the commissioners, sometimes more directly than others, and so we're open to change. We're open to having you know, a tweaking of our language and a tweaking of our mindset in terms of what maybe that coaches committee looks like. And maybe a coaches committee isn't the best way of describing it, because when we say coaches committee, it's okay, open for anyone who's a coach in the province. So I think there will potentially be some changes before we vote and before this comes to the AGM. So Paul, I'd be patient with that, and hopefully we'll be able to sort of allay maybe perhaps some of your concerns with that. A seat at the table is, you know, our sport experts. We still need them to be sport experts, right? We still need those people who are passionate about their sports to want to continue to be passionate about their sports and to be able to volunteer their time. So I don't think we're looking to just wash our hands of it and say goodbye commissioners, goodbye volunteers. It's on us now. That's not the intent at all. And so hopefully, if the changes that I have envisioned, and again, I don't want to go into detail too greatly. Our board hasn't fleshed out what exactly that will look like yet, but just know that we have heard some of that discussion and we are looking at it.
Brent, maybe you want to address, before we get to the question from Courtney and Zoel, Paul's question about what about the commissions that are full societies? What happens if this model is approved?
So if the proposal is not approved, we're status quo.
No, I was asking you would respond to Paul's follow-up question about what happens to the
commissioners that are full societies and running each other's work. I'd have to probably bring Jordan in for that.
Sure.
So Jordan.
Yeah. Well, basically, and this is part of the issue with when we looked at the legal and liability side of it. There's this massive gray area that is kind of a mess because the commissions are technically standing committees, but a handful of them are also their own independent organizations, which you can't really be both. And so for those commissions that are societies that do have their own bylaws and are registered with the province as a not-for-profit under the Society Act, they will continue to function. We have no ability to disband them as a society. That's way outside our purview. You know, BC School of Sports has the control of the sport, so to speak, in the interscholastic setting. So then each commission would then have to ask itself, does it wish to continue with a different sort of focus and mandate? And maybe there's the ability to, maybe they look at it's operating in a different way that doesn't control sort of the championships themselves, but are involved as a partner with BC School of Sports. Or some may choose just to wind down and dissolve, and that'll be up to their members and how they operate and decisions that are guided by their bylaws. So that'll be that's not a BC School of Sports decision. Each commission will have to view sort of how they want to approach that.
Okay, and then Brent was starting to answer the question about what happens if this governance model is not approved at the next AGM.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So from,
As Brent said, it's status quo. Then we carry on, but recognizing that, as we said quite a bit earlier this morning, the gaming commission is asking for a change, for greater accountability over the funds that we receive from them, and so that needs to happen in some way. The board can't change the structure of the organization, so that has to come from an AGM, from the members. I guess worst case scenario, and I'm not fear mongering at all, because I don't know that this would happen, is something could be imposed on us. That would be highly unlikely, but certainly some degree of accountability could be imposed on us. It could be demanded of us, and so those are real things that this model is. That's not kind of the underlying purpose behind it. We really think that there's a better way to run school sport in BC. And at the same time, the province, through the Gaming Commission, is asking for greater accountability, or demanding it, I should say, not asking for it. And so we understand we have to do that. And we think this model will meet those two objectives. But if it doesn't pass, then we'll have to continue to tweak it and bring it back. Any other questions?
So we had Mike Muncy
More.
requires some explanation, and so just before Mike starts here, I think maybe we'll go for another 5 or 6 minutes, and if there are any other questions, those can be forwarded on in writing, and we can do our best to respond in writing there. So Mike, if you would unmute yourself and ask your question, then we can do the best to answer it.
All right. Is this working? Mic working here?
Yeah. Good.
Okay. I was just speaking from a member of the executive for the Wrestling Commission, and I know there's some concern, and we've talked about it a little bit, but I don't know if enough thought is being given to it. I think the real concern, the selling this to membership, and I'm on the fence. I don't know where I am. When we were running our provincial championships, we were on a rotating model, and we had to move away from it because it was supposed to be this zone's turn, and nobody would step up to host it. It's supposed to be this, and nobody would step up to host it. So we've had to go to a permanent site, and it's helped us get volunteers, and it comes back to that volunteers. There's a real fear, I think, from our commission and our sport that ours is one that's kind of ripe to be selected to go back to that rotating model, but it didn't work year in, year out. It always fell on one guy who would have to step in and pick up the pieces and run the tournament when nobody else would step up to do it. And so why are we doing this? Why not just make it a permanent site and establish a championship committee like basketball runs? And it's worked out really well. And I think it's we know basketball's still going to be a fixed site. It's so big. Volleyball's a lot of these aren't going to change, but I think for kind of these mid-level sports, like your cross country, like your aquatics, there's a real fear from these commissions that their championships are really going to suffer as a result.
So I think, Mike, the first thing to answer your question here is that centralized championships will remain centralized. So no one is going to force wrestling to go back to a model where they move around the province. If this has been successful for your sport, you have a contract with, I believe it's the LEC, that will continue. And that goes into Paul's question as well, in terms of commissions with having contracts with facilities. BC School Sports would assume those contracts, and the sponsorship would remain, right? So this is not a way for, a lot of events are very successful where they are. There's no question about that, right? The LEC is a great facility. Different sport, boys soccer at Burnaby Lakes, right? We've come to a point where some sports work better where they moving around, and other sports are good at a centralized location. So I think that's important to talk about and to understand. So I'm going to talk about to understand. We're not going to force. No one is going to force. No legislative assembly. No one's going to say wrestling, you have to move. By the way, it's going to Prince George next year. And the year after that, it's going to Cranbrook. And the year after that, it's going to Victoria. Okay, because we know that some sports, it's a difficult thing to find hosts.
Paul raised the question about the, he used an example of the grade 9 basketball provincials, which are not BCSS events. So I think what you do in asking that question is raise an example of how school sport has been allowed to operate this way. So grade 9 tournament, not a BCSS sponsored event, has in some cases, I think the boys have assumed, boys commission, basketball commission has assumed responsibility for it or oversight of it. And so it gets complicated. They're not obligated to follow all BCSS rules because they're not a BCSS event. Okay, sorry, Paul. I understood that maybe that's the girls that have taken it over the grade 9 tournament. I understood that the boys have as well. But they are required to follow BCSS eligibility rules because the student's eligibility is determined and maintained by BCSS. But how teams qualify, the number of teams, that is not something that BCSS oversees because they're not BCSS events.
Rick, I can just add some further context to that because it's really just a question about existing policy more so than what would happen, I guess. So in this case, the policy is clear that if it's a member school hosted event, then it's sanctioned if it's with other member schools, and they have to follow all the eligibility rules of BC School of Sports, as Rick just said. If it's being hosted by what we would call a third party, which is basically a non-member school, whether that be a private fundraising group, a university or college, whoever else it might be, they require sanctioning from BC School of Sports prior to hosting that event. And if any BC School of Sports member schools participate in a non-sanctioned event, their team could potentially be disqualified from postseason play, and there's penalties that go with that. So while it's essentially an invitational event is what it is, and they call it the provincials, and really it's a year-end invitational. And so no different than Paul at OKM, when you host your start of the season volleyball tournament, who comes and how you decide the draw and so forth is entirely up to you. But you are required, as are all the schools participating, to follow the BC School of Sports eligibility rules. So that is basically the exact same expectation for any of those events.
Mike is asking about process for zone reps being put forward. BCSS is not planning on telling each zone how they will allocate or determine who their 3 reps are. We have some guidance around the makeup of it in terms of gender equity, but we are not planning on giving directives to each zone to fill their 3 spots.
I can jump in there again. I've talked to some zones. Some zones are planning on doing it on a rotation. Some are planning on doing it on an election type style. There's a bunch of different methods that they can follow, and so each zone will be responsible for determining how they want to put their 3 people forward.
Yeah, and I know that with South Fraser here, we have 3 districts, and it makes sense for us to have one representative from each district. So with Vancouver Island, could be a possibility where one's South Island, one's Central, and one's North. But that's again up to the zone to determine.
Thank you, Paul, for your comment. Any other comments or questions?
I think at this point they can forward those questions to Jordan. We can include them in the next Q&A.
Yeah.
Which hopefully is as well attended and well reasoned as this one. So I know I missed the first half, but I'm sure Rick did as well in that half without me as he did while I was here.
Yeah, so again, thanks to all of you for joining in, and I'll echo Brent's comments. Really appreciated your participation this morning. Great questions. This is not a final model yet. We're continuing to make tweaks as good ideas come our way, and we plan to keep doing that until we are satisfied. We hope that the majority of people in BC will be satisfied as well as we bring it to an AGM next spring. All right, I will bring this morning's meeting to an end then. Thanks again. Have a great day.